Whether you're doing a self-assessment, preparing for a DCMA assessment, or the future CMMC certification assessment, you got to nail your scope. And we're going to show you how to do it. In today's masterclass, Coby Pennington, James Hill from Castle Lock are going to show you how to nail your scope and how to master the scope portion of your assessment. Coby, what's going on?
Scoping is the critical thing to get right. The scope is really the boundary of your area and that is going to receive, store, process, transmit CUI.
So hold on a second. These are words that are in the DFAR 7012, store, transmit, process. What do these things mean? So if I'm going to store CUI, what does it mean?
To store data means it's going to reside within your covered information system. So in some kind of digital format, it's going to reside in your environment, in a hard drive, in a storage array, potentially even cloud storage that you're using. That's going to reside within control of your organization to protect while you have that information, while you're using that information.
So that reminds me of data at rest, something we talk about when we talk about encryption. Data in transit, transmission, and what about processing? What is that?
Processing is data while it's being used. Sometimes those controls may appear the same from how we actually achieve those. So processing data is data that's in use. It's in use by an application. It's in use in some kind of operational technology. The data's in motion. Some of those safeguards may be the same safeguards as when it's in rest. For example, we may have that information encrypted. We may have that information protected, only accessible by users that need that information, or only accessible to certain software or processes that are using that information for, let's say, software testing or equipment testing that we're doing. It's not always going to be different in how we meet it, but it is important to know that at rest typically means it's in storage. We're not using it at the moment while being processed. We're actively doing something.
So when we're formulating our scope and trying to understand what we're responsible for, and we're specifically doing this within the realm of NIST 800-171, we've received a clause that's flowed down either from the government or from a prime or from another vendor that we're doing business for. This stuff in DFAR 7012, protecting CUI, we really, when we want to understand the scope of what we're trying to do here and what we're trying to protect, the scope really involves how you receive that data, so in transit to you, how you store that data, where it sits when nobody's using it, and how you process that data while you're using it, where does it go? So when we're building scope, we want to keep those things in mind. How do we know, Coby, what CUI data is?
Yeah, so it actually should be really easy. It's not. But there are some steps that we can take to make sure that we're doing everything that we can. And the reason why I say that it's not is because despite CUI being a fairly old standard, its maturity within U.S. government is still evolving. And we've seen a lot of movement here recently, and we know that there's some things coming out soon that are really going to help with this effort. But the U.S. government has to be able to define this in their contracts. They have to be able to mark this data consistently. They have to tell us as a contractor, hey, this particular test plan or this particular software that you're going to develop for this contract, that should be considered or labeled CUI. And while that has been maturing quite a bit, the first thing to do is check your contracts. The 7012 clause is going to show up in a lot of contracts, even if you're not necessarily receiving CUI. If it does show up, but you don't have CUI, you're not generating CUI, and you've verified that with your contract representative, then you really don't have to implement those particular safeguards because you don't have the data to protect, even though the clause is there. But if the clause is there and you go into your contract And there's several different pieces of contract documentation that you could be looking for. If U.S. government or your prime is passing down on behalf of U.S. government requirements for protecting CUI, then you have to have an environment to do these things we're talking about: store, process, receive, transmit.
So we want to really master defining the scope for our information system. An information system is just a fancy word of how you're referring back to the computers and users and servers that all store, process, and transmit CUI. And so an information system can be a small thing within an existing enterprise, or it can be considered the whole enterprise. First of all, if we're looking at how do we nail our scope and how do we master our scope, there are a few things to consider. One, Coby was talking about, where is this data? How did I get it? What's my responsibility to do with it? Two, what are all my users that actually have to need this information and use and iterate on this? What are the computers, information system, servers, mail servers, FTP servers, web servers that all have to interact with this information? What are my assets? What's in scope? What's out of scope? And really, what's the boundary? How do I do this? If you want to master your scope, you need to know where the CUI is coming in, what your contractual obligations are, which users need it, what assets process it, store it, or transmit it, and what's the segmentation between those assets and the rest of your enterprise. Coby, what is the big deal with all the assets?
The assets are really important because if CUI is in scope or out of scope, or how it affects your information system, then this can be a good understanding of that is extremely helpful. Because the tighter that you can define a boundary and says, okay, these systems are going to receive this information in this way, we're going to store and process it in these ways, and are limiting the systems that touch CUI, then you can reduce your scope. We've gotten through our contractual obligations. We've checked DD 254s if it's applicable, that we're also receiving some classified information or memorandums that have been shared with us that tell us how to handle CUI. Maybe they even tell us how to handle legacy information like FOUO that we might need to be treating as CUI according to this contract. And we know the flow of the data. The more that we can eliminate it in these different asset types gives us a lot more flexibility. This lowers our total cost because everywhere that CUI exists, we have to implement all of the controls of NIST 800-171. What is the CMMC L2 under the layer 2, under the 2.0 model, to be properly securing these assets. But we know that the DIB is made up of a lot of operational technology, industrial control type systems. We know that maybe our whole organization doesn't need to be secured to the level of CMMC. And there's certainly trade-offs in carving these out. And, I think it'd be good to talk about, some of those carve-outs, doing this as more of an enclave or a subset of our environment versus doing the whole enterprise.
So the enclave idea, you're a company, you got 100 employees, you got 25 guys that are doing BD, you got another 20 guys in management, you got 2 system administrators, you got a handful of sales guys, and you have maybe 5 guys that are actually going to react and interact with this CUI. You're saying, don't worry about all the other guys except for the ones that are going to be working on CUI?
From a scoping perspective, that's definitely your focus, right? Follow the data. Is there a way that we can carve out their functional operations as it pertains to CUI in a way that would allow us to have a smaller scope? Here's the benefits. With a smaller scope, the expense of implementing these controls go down. Our system security plan is simpler. It's easier for us to assess our organization. We know exactly where our data is. We have provided the right sizing type of protections for our organization. That's all good stuff. Now, there is benefit anytime that we're advancing the maturity of our security for the organization. And so there's no reason not to apply as many of these controls as we can to our overall enterprise. But even if you want to take that approach, right, this is an opportunity for our organization to improve our overall security. We think that that's really worth it. There's no reason to jeopardize the assessment, make it a larger assessment, introduce more technologies and things that actually have to be assessed that way. We can still certainly do that and we'll certainly benefit from it, but then it'll be much more efficient during our assessments that we have people focused in on the key areas where we're actually processing this data and we have the maturity around our processes, our technology, and how our people behave when interacting with CUI.
So even though we might have a small information system enclave within our larger enterprise, if our larger enterprise isn't as mature as it needs to be to support and put technical controls around this information, that may be a great use case for just focusing on the smaller enclave.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about finding the CUI, understanding your contractual obligations, building your scope boundary, how to create an enclave, how to apply the technology and the framework to your enterprise. But we said before that our contractual obligations, our legal obligations, our flow, how it comes in and out are all important. But how do we identify the users that actually need access to this information? I mean, we're a large company. We have employees. We have contractors. We have vendors. We have all kinds of people coming in, right? How do we determine which users are required to be in our enclave with us?
For CUI, the government uses a term of lawful government purpose, which essentially means that these users need access to this CUI to be able to fulfill our contract, to be able to deliver as expected what we've been contracted to do. If a user needs a drawing to be able to help fabricate a piece of equipment and that drawing is CUI, then certainly, that person would need access to that CUI. And there are several different use cases that would really follow the nature of our business, right? What have we been contracted to deliver? Do we need this data to be able to deliver this? Are we working with this data? Are we using this data to build? You can think of it, even though it's not like a need to know type of data categorization, it really is like what users need this information to be able to deliver. Those are your CUI users.
So we talked about users, finding the data flows, how to understand what your obligations are. Let's talk about assets. So if we're building an enclave or if we have an enterprise, we're always going to have assets. We're going to have people's laptop computers, their phones. We're going to have routers and switches and firewalls. We're going to have mail servers and FTP servers and web servers. So we have needs for things. We have applications that we need as an organization to be successful. The different types of assets that are defined in the scoping guidance for level 2 really revolve around 5 different categories. We have our CUI asset, which you've been hearing a lot about CUI on these videos, and that's because that's what we're trying to protect here. But we also have things called a security protection asset. Some of these examples are going to be management servers and routers and switches that actually provide access into these enclaves or provide management of these assets that store CUI. We have contractor risk managed assets. We have things called specialized assets. And we have the out of scope assets. So things that are not even going to touch CUI. So we have different delineations between these different assets. And so the next couple of minutes, we're going to be talking specifically around these assets. And we're starting with CUI assets. Coby, talk to us. What exactly is a CUI asset?
Now, you talked about the 5 different asset types, and I think it really makes sense to think of this almost as 3 different tiers. So, and I'll talk about why, because our obligations to some of these asset types are very similar. For example, the CUI assets and the security protection assets are going to require the same kind of assessment and controls and obligations. Let's kind of think of this as our CUI type of tier for our scoping. This is information that an asset says 100% in scope for assessing against your controls. They're in scope. They need to be fully documented in the SSP. Before we get quite into that, a CUI asset is an asset. It's a information system that is processing, storing, or transmitting CUI. A security protection asset, which I consider part of this kind of CUI tier, is an asset that provides security functions to support that CUI environment. So think of things like a logging system that's collecting logs from your different servers and endpoints and network equipment. It's gathering that in one place. That security protection asset would need to be in scope for the CMMC controls, as well as like your antivirus software and things like that. So the systems that actually contain the CUI and the systems that are providing security protection for the CUI. Now, our obligations there are that we need to take these assets and we need to have them completely documented in an asset inventory.
Oh, wait a second. You just reminded me of the SSP. So SSP section, we have the asset identified in the SSP. Here's all the assets that are part of this information system. And these are going to be storing CUI, processing, transmitting. And then in that same asset inventory, we're going to have our security something assets.
Yeah, our security protection assets.
Absolutely. Exactly.
All of that goes into the asset inventory. That asset inventory is really just a foundational piece of information security. You can't protect what you don't have. You can't secure data that you don't know where it resides. Asset inventory goes into your SSP. You document that into your assessment scope, which is really what you're doing when you do those things, gathering the inventory, including them in the SSP, and then knowing that all of these systems are going to be fully assessed against your CMMC practices.
You know, this isn't the first time I've heard, like, if I want to do compliance or I want to secure my environment, I need to actually have a good asset inventory. I mean, I think I would say that having a comprehensive, accurate, up-to-date asset inventory should be pretty much IT 101, right?
You would hope. It's ideal, right? For the reasons I just mentioned, it's really important. We often find that this is one of the hardest things for organizations to do, is actually put together a good list of their asset inventory and be able to manage that as the environment, as their business grows, as they acquire more assets, be able to keep that up to date, really paramount to security. But this is somewhere that organizations really struggle. And this is one of our foundational kind of series of videos. Nailing asset inventory is one of those key components that the better you're able to do it, the more that's going to pay off in the future. Is really going to give you a good foundation.
So we said, if you want to know how to do your assessment right, you got to nail your scope. If you want to know how to do cybersecurity, you got to nail your asset inventory.
Absolutely.
So the next asset class we want to talk about here in relationship to scoping is something called contractor risk managed asset. So in a contractor risk managed asset, you have an asset in the environment that is not supposed to store CUI, that you have a set of policies and procedures that are in place to prevent that asset from storing CUI. That asset is capable. It can even exist in the same boundary as your CUI asset, but you're using policies, procedures, and the risk management framework to restrict access to those assets. Now, your requirements are, you have in your SSP the section for the asset inventory. You have in your SSP the diagram, the network diagram. On this, you're going to have these assets identified both in the inventory and on the diagram. And you want to make sure that this is documented in your SSP about how you're using these policies, procedures, and to meet these practices. You also want to make sure that you have evidence that you're doing what you're saying you're doing, so that when you're assessed for these assets specifically, that you can prove that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. Now, when an assessor, a third-party assessor, comes in to assess your environment specifically for this, should that happen to you, they are going to be looking at your documentation, and if it's not cinched up well enough, they're going to extend their sampling into your contractor risk managed assets to see if you're enforcing and doing what you're saying you're doing. So you've got a little bit of a chance if your policy procedures don't line up, but do your best to make those things line up. It'll make your life way easy.
Yeah. And that's especially important because within this, back in some this kind of tier concept with these assets is specialized assets. One of the biggest problems with the CMMC original model was that it was really kind of considered a traditional type of IT model, which was be more of a business system environment versus some of the operational technology or industrial control technology that is often in use in the DIB. And these are specialized assets. These could include government furnished equipment. This is equipment that may or may not be intended to store CUI that is going to be required to meet all of these contractor risk management policies and procedures that you're defining. This is great flexibility for the industrial base, but where especially we would have a hard time implementing the letter of law of some of these 800 and 171 controls. It's not just the easy do nothing button. We're still expected to protect these systems based on the risk to these systems. So when James was talking about the contractor risk managed systems and those policies and procedures, those need to be built with your specialized assets in mind as well, and any risk that exists for those types of assets. So it's really important that you're thinking about those things together because they may get spot checked. We still have to document them in the SSP. And if we do a good job with our documentation, then we don't have to assess those against the CMMC controls. So great flexibility, but we got to be diligent about our implementation of these different types of assets.
And your SSP is your story. I mean, you want to make sure in your SSP you can show the flow of data into and out of these assets. You want to make sure that you can identify these assets and how they're contractor risk managed. So for the CUI assets, you've got your flow in and out. For your boundary, you have your network diagram where you've specifically identified where your CUI assets live. You've got your policies and procedures that interact with your contractor risk managed assets.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect point. And that's really what it comes back to is this is where we're protecting our CUI. This is where we're using our CUI. Outside of that, certainly benefit from everything that we want to do on the CMMC side to advance the security of our organization. But we don't have to worry about that from an auditor's perspective. We narrow the scope of contractors' help. If you're bringing in someone to help, you're lowering what it costs to actually assess and achieve your audit or in the future your certification. So it's a huge win-win.
So I hope you're enjoying this series. We're working very, very hard to provide free, usable content around DFARS, around CMMC, referenceable policies, referenceable documentation, things that you can take and use in your environment today to get this stuff done. If you have any additional ideas, some things that you'd specifically like us to talk to, reply back in the comments for the video, and we're happy to entertain those topics as we move through away from our core foundational topics and on to assessing controls. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.